Hi everyone. Just leaving work, and as many of you know, I work in the ER now, hopefully full time. But I also basically work on the psychiatric unit, and I wanted to talk about mental health, something that I obviously feel very passionate about, something that I basically deal with day in, day out. And I think it's something that is unfortunately quite misunderstood. I think there's a lot of stigma about it. I think there's a lot of misinformation about it, and a lot of stereotypes about it. And I think it's really important that we actually have this conversation about mental health. So basically today I want to talk about depression and anxiety. Of course, you've got a lot of other things that fall under mental health, such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, dementia kind of falls under mental health. But today specifically, let's talk about depression and anxiety. So to me, depression and anxiety are two sides of the same coin. So you can have depression and it shows up in different ways, right? So depression so let's talk about what causes it. It can be genetically, you could be genetically predisposed to it. That means it's in your family history. You might have uncles or aunts or grandparents that might have had depression. The problem is that until I think this generation, we never really talked about it, right? So we always had that uncle or aunt who was kind of weird, or kind of, they were always just grouchy, or they were always just, kind of a drama queen, and we label them as such. But we never understood it to be where it was a mental health issue, that they actually were suffering from depression. So genetically predisposed is one thing, but that is not the only thing that is a definite you're going to get depression or anxiety. Life happens to all of us, right? And how we deal with life also determines, whether you end up with depression, whether it's a short-term depression or whether it's long-term depression. So, traumatic experiences, whether it's divorce, whether it's, the death of someone, whether it's a sickness, whether it's a car accident, whether it's something totally external, it doesn't matter, anything and everything, whether it's abuse of some sort, physical, emotional, psychological, domestic violence, it doesn't really matter. Many different things, anything really can cause trauma. And how we cope with trauma, it really depends individually on our personal makeup, how do we have the coping skills, and there are many, many different things that, people do. Some are just very spiritual and religious and they turn to God, wonderful. Some have a strong support system, so they are able to talk about their feelings and they're okay. I know that, when I'm having a rough day, when I'm going through stressful stuff, I tend to paint, or I will meditate, or I'll go for a swim, or I'll go for a walk. Those are my safe coping skills, or, those are some things. How does it show up? What does depression look like? What does anxiety look like? So depression shows up in different ways. People that suffer from depression tend to, of course, there's this heavy, there was a wonderful commercial many years ago, and it still might be about some medication that they were promoting to treat depression, and it showed a person, no matter where they went, there was a cloud, like a rain cloud that followed them everywhere, right? And it's like, no matter where you go, it's like depression is like that, so it's this heaviness, this sadness, feelings of hopelessness. People that are depressed tend to isolate. They don't want to deal with people. You stop taking care of your personal needs. So you stop showering, start bumming around the house in the same clothes. Yeah, you change and you freshen up, but you really just don't have the energy to do anything. It feels like your bones hurt, right? I know this feeling way too well because, again, I've lived with depression for 20 plus years. For me, it started with when I was pregnant with my first child, and it kind of never went away. But I also have a history of sexual abuse where I was sexually molested at the age of 2 till I was 12 years old. 6 different people that I am aware of. So and I thought it was totally normal. So that didn't affect me until I came to the realization of what I had experienced. And then, dealing with that, and then of course the pregnancy, and it just changed my hormonal. It took me until probably recently where I didn't have the right coping mechanisms, to deal with the depression. So anxiety is just the other side of it, right? Anxiety shows up, it's still depression, but it shows up as your constant racing thoughts, your overthinking, you're always worried about your past, you're stressing about the future, you're overthinking things. There's episodes of mania where there's your impulsive behavior. You might go on a shopping spree when you're in the manic episode. You might have, irresponsible, unsafe sex with people. You might just sort of, be really happy and go party, and, just sort of, really, really hyper and go through like bursts of energy where you're not sleeping for a couple of days. Those are all symptoms of mania, but it's based in deep-seated sadness, deep-seated depression. It's still depression. It's just it shows up in the form of anxiety. And so, how do you deal with that, right? So I think it's important. There's a couple of different ways, to deal with that. You've got medication, which absolutely helps. And I think it should definitely be considered. It's people who don't want to deal with depression by taking medication. It's like saying, I have diabetes, but I'm not going to deal with insulin. I'm just going to pray about it, and I'm going to talk about, how much diabetes is affecting me, and I'm going to be fine with it. There's such a stigma about, they have a mental illness. If I'm taking medication to address my depression, then there might be something wrong with me. I'm actually crazy, with all the good intentions. People say things, they're just crazy. No, they have a mental illness. We need to change the dialogue. We need to change the conversation about it. And it really starts with as good intended as you are. And yes, they might be acting a little crazy per se, but understand that they're doing it because they're going through an episode. They're not quite well. So let's change the language that we use to discuss it. Let's call it for what it is. Let's say this person has anxiety issues. This is how they're acting. Let's not call them, they're just crazy, because we're not helping the conversation as we try to minimize that. So I think medication is definitely important, but I don't think medication is the only solution, and I don't think it's always needed. I think therapy along with medication is a must. Usually just the fact that you can talk about something, it's a release, right? And I don't know if I talked about this, but I think talking about it, if you talk about it with your friends, that's great. It's wonderful if you have your support system. But I think it's more important to talk about it with a professional. Why? Let me tell you. Because, first of all, your loved ones, your friends, your family, they're not trained professionals. They don't know always how to take that information and what to do with it, right? They also tend to get into solution mode. Okay, so they tend to get into trying to give you solutions of what you should be doing, and a therapist will not always do that. A therapist is trained to be able to listen and then ask you questions to help you come to the realization, because human nature is that we don't like to be told what to do. We don't like to we don't want solutions. At that point, we just want to share what we're feeling, and sometimes just sharing alone is helpful. Alicia, I'm reading. So Alicia is a fellow therapist and a fellow social worker, and she does amazing work. And she writes, I think a willingness to address the issue is important and works well with medication if needed and therapy. Agreed, absolutely. So, this is where I think first of all, acknowledging that there's an issue is the first step towards any change. And I talked about this in my little video that I did about, the process of spiritually waking up. But I think the process of any kind of change, it's the same idea that applies. Let's acknowledge there's a problem, number one. Number two, let's then hopefully